Hello everyone, this is a short revision clip on indirect taxation as a form of government intervention to correct market failure. Now this will apply to students studying both Year 1 and Year 2 AQA A-level economics. So we'll go straight into it. By definition then, an indirect tax is imposed on producers or suppliers by the government. So the government have complete control over who and what they place a tax on. An indirect tax is different from a direct tax. A direct tax is a tax on income. It is a tax on earnings. An indirect tax is often said to be imposed on goods and services. It's a tax on consumption. It's a tax on the goods and services that we as consumers often purchase within society. Some examples of taxes placed or indirect taxes placed on certain goods would include duties on cigarettes, alcohol and fuel, and also VAT. Now, VAT stands for value added tax. It's different from a unit tax. Value added tax, often referred to as an ad valorem tax, which is Latin for value added. VAT is a percentage of the value of the good. A carbon tax is also an indirect tax. Indirect taxes are a form of government intervention in markets. Governments intervene in markets through indirect taxes to manipulate the prices that consumers pay in order then to manipulate consumption of how much is actually produced and consumed within society. Some examples here of indirect taxes in the UK. You may be familiar with a number of these already. We've mentioned before VAT, value added tax. Standard rate there would be about 20%. It is a percentage of the value of the good. Landfill tax, you've got £80 per tonne of waste. Think about the negative externalities associated with landfill. You've got obviously significant amounts of pollution. You've got smell, you've got visual pollution, you've got gases that are being released into the air, having a negative impact on the environment in which we live in. Governments want to try and reduce the amount of waste that we are throwing away. Remember that we are an increasing economy in terms of population size. There are now more people living within the UK than what there is ever done so before. Population numbers are growing, therefore people are becoming wealthier. Therefore, we purchase more goods and services, so naturally, by default, we will experience having more waste. By placing quite a heavy tax on waste of £80 per tonne, what the government are doing is they're hitting us where it hurts when it comes to our limited income. We know that we've got disposable income, or that our disposable income is limited. By placing that tax on landfill, it will reduce our disposable income, but also will seek to try and change our behaviour. Now, we want to change our behaviour towards things like greater levels of recycling, for example. We have seen that our behaviour in terms of recycling has changed quite significantly over the years. More people recycle now in the UK than what we have ever done so before, and more people are aware of the benefits of recycling than what we would have done so before. If we look at fuel duties, you're taxed at 58 pence per litre. So when you fill up your car with petrol or diesel at the petrol pumps, 58 pence per litre of fuel will go to the government in the form of a fuel duty tax. Again, that's designed to try and reduce the amount of journeys that we do in our car, to try and avoid us driving all over the place, because remember that creates further pollution where you've got carbon emissions being released into the air. That has a negative impact upon the environment. Pollution levels are rising, particularly in built up areas like London. For example, if you think about the introduction of moving out to the north and south circular roads to try and reduce adding an increase in that congestion charge, to try and stop people from traveling more frequently into the city centre because of the impact that can have on the people living within the town. If we look at alcohol duties, we've got a beer tax of 41.5 pence per pint. Think about, again, the negative impacts associated with drinking alcohol. Think about the things like liver cancer, for example. It can lead to various forms of alcohol-fueled violence, which obviously has negative impacts on third parties. Look at tobacco duties, £3.76 per pack, and 17% of VAT then in addition to that in terms of tobacco duties. So they're very heavily taxed in the UK. Think of things like lung cancer that can cause from excessive levels of smoking. Now, the government are saying that if you want to smoke, you can. However, excessive smoking can have a negative impact upon somebody's health. Air passenger duty, you've got bans based on distance. So the longer somebody travels, the greater the tax they will have to pay as a result of their journey. So the greater levels of air passenger duty to try and stop people from traveling too frequently from one country to the next, particularly dependent upon distance. The dangers with cheap flights is that people will take up that offer of wanting to travel from one country to the next, not really realizing the negative impact that can have on the environment by traveling via plane. Some chains of analysis then on taxation, indirect taxation. So VAT is a tax placed on the expenditure, a tax set as a percentage of the price of the good. So you take the value of the good and then you add on a percentage of VAT, which is a percentage of the value of the good. A tax increases the cost of production, causing an inward shift in the supply curve. So a tax in the first instance will affect the producer. It will decrease the amount of which the producer is willing and able to supply of the good, because it reduces the profit incentive in which the producer has to produce that good. The vertical distance between the pre-tax and the post-tax supply curve shows the tax per unit, and we'll look at that on our diagram next. But a unit tax is a parallel shift between the original supply curve and the new supply curve. With an indirect tax, the supplier may be able to pass on some or all of this burden on the consumer through a higher price. So when a tax is placed on a good, in the first instance, it's placed on the producer. But what the producer can do, because if they face a downward sloping demand curve, that means they've got control over prices. They possess some degree of monopoly power. They can pass on that cost to the consumers in the form of a higher price. Now, the amount of which they pass on will be dependent upon the elasticity of demand for the good. And we will have a look at the diagram now in a minute that will show that burden of tax. This is known as shifting the burden of tax of and the ability of the business to do this depends on the price elasticity of demand and supply. If you use your common sense looking at some of those examples that we've talked about already about indirect taxation, most of them, if not all of them, are inelastic goods. They are goods that possess negative externalities in consumption. They are demerit goods. They are goods in which the government feel that we overconsume and that we're not fully aware of the negative impacts they have on our life. So I'm going to switch over now to the visualizer. So hopefully you'll be able now to see this. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to draw my diagram from scratch and talk you through how to draw that indirect taxation diagram for A-level economics. So on the y-axis, I've drawn my axes already. On the y-axis, I've got price, 0 in the corner, and quantity on the x-axis. Now, I'm going to try and make this diagram more realistic, and by doing that, like I said, a tax is often placed on inelastic goods. So it makes it only right that if I'm going to draw this diagram once, I'm going to draw it properly. So I'm going to draw a relatively downward sloping, inelastic, steeper demand curve. I'm going to title that as D. So my normal demand curve, which is downward sloping, which means the firm possesses some degree of monopoly power. But it is a downward sloping curve, but it's much steeper, indicating it's a relatively inelastic demand curve. In addition then to that, I'm going to draw a normal upward sloping supply curve. I'm going to title that as S. And once I do that, I'm going to indicate my equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in a free market. Now, as you will know already at this stage, if you're tuning into this video, you will know that a free market is a market that is free from any form of government intervention. It is opened up to what we call the disciplines of the free market, meaning the government have no control. Supply and demand is moving freely to meet the needs of the consumers and producers. Now, I'm going to use an example here on cigarettes. We'll say that, I know this is random figures, but we'll just keep it simple mathematics. If we say the free market sets prices at £10, we have a situation in which supply and demand is set by the free market forces of supply. So the equilibrium price is set by the free market forces of supply and demand. The issue here is that with there being no government intervention, the government feel that the price of £10 is too low. There are too many people in the economy that can purchase cigarettes because it's financially viable to do so. £10 is not a high enough price. If we make it more expensive, then we exclude members of society from that, from purchasing that good. So governments intervene in the form of a tax. As I mentioned earlier, a tax will decrease the supply of a good or service. So we experience an inward shift in the supply curve from S going into S1, and then in brackets, I'm going to title that as tax. And that's indicating that the reason for that inward shift, it has been brought about because of taxation. So all other things held equal, supply has shifted inwards to the left, supply has decreased because the government has imposed an indirect tax. Because of that shift inwards of the supply curve, we now have, as you can see, a new equilibrium. So my original equilibrium was at point A, and my new equilibrium now is at point B. So I'm going to do my new dashed lines to show my new equilibrium. I'm going to call that Q1 and P1. Now, for argument's sake, so obviously I don't buy cigarettes, so I wouldn't know the price of them. But P1, I'm going to, for simple mathematics, I'm simply going to say that's £15. Okay, so I've taken a price of cigarette that was once £10, I've now increased it up to £15. So this inward shift in the supply curve has made the good more expensive. So consumers now have to pay £15 for the one packet of cigarettes as opposed to the original £10 that they would have once purchased. From point A up to point B, as you can see, because of that decrease in supply, prices increase from 10 up to 15. Therefore, I've got a contraction in demand. The law of demand, as price increases from 10 up to 15, quantity will fall from Q to Q1. Consumers are hit where it hurts. They've got limited income. This increase in tax reduces their disposable income, therefore reduces the incentive to want to purchase the good. Now, the vertical distance, the tax per unit, if I go to point B, and if I move down here, I'm going to call this point C, the vertical distance between the two supply curves from point B, move down to C, and then do a dashed line going across, I've then got my two burdens of tax. I'm going to call that P2, and then again, simple mathematics, I'm just going to call this, or give a title of £9. So from B to C is our tax per unit. And again, if we look at the mathematics, the difference between 15 and 9, I take 15 minus 9, which would give me a tax per unit of £6. Okay, so £6 per pack goes to the government in the form of an indirect taxation. So consumers have to pay £15 for their packet of cigarettes, of which £6 per pack will go to the government in the form of tax revenue. Now, to work out the total area of tax revenue, you would take £6 and you would multiply it by whatever figure Q1 would be. Okay. This decrease in supply increases the price of the good, causes a contraction from point A up to point B. As a result, quantity falls on the x-axis from Q to Q1. Now, Q was if you remember, was the original equilibrium quantity under the free market. Q1 is what we call the socially optimum level of output. This is a level of output of which the government deemed to be socially acceptable within society. Q is too much. Q1 is the socially optimum, the socially desirable level of output. Okay. On this diagram now, you've got two areas. So the first one is, I'm going to highlight this in yellow. And if you remember me saying before, we looked at the burdens of tax. So you've got two areas here. You've got the yellow area, and then you've got the blue area below. Now, as you can see visually on this diagram, I'm going to call it area X and area Y. So area X is the yellow area, and area Y is the blue area. Now, area X is our tax burden on the consumer. And then subsequently then, process of elimination, area Y is the tax burden on the producer. Okay, now, if you draw conclusions from this, or certainly if you draw the conclusions that I would like you to draw, you can see that because the good is inelastic, we've actually experienced quite an increase in price from 10 up to 15, but quantity has only fallen slightly from Q to Q1. Because the good is inelastic, the consumer is hit the hardest with the tax. The consumer pays the greater burden of tax. So if you look at the tax per unit that's paid by the producer, sorry, paid by the consumer, it's 15 minus 10, which is £5. The tax per unit paid by the producer is 10 minus 9, which is only £1. So the consumer, because of the good being inelastic, the consumer pays the greater burden of price. What we also experience here, another really good area to always make reference to, this will always get you more marks, is the orange area, the triangular area, as students often refer to it as. And this is what we call our welfare loss or our deadweight loss. Now, students will always ask, well, what exactly does this welfare loss or this deadweight loss actually mean? And if we were to put this into context, so again, I'm going to use, I like using simple maths. If I put Q as 20 and Q1 as 16, for example, that's a, because of the increase in price from 10 up to 15, I subsequently have pushed 4 people out of the market, or I've reduced quantity by 4. So I've gone from 20 down to 16. I've reduced consumption by 4. These 4 people, if we say that there are 4 people, assuming that each quantity is one person that buys 1 packet of cigarettes, I have excluded 4 people from the market. These people can no longer purchase the good, even if the good's bad for them. They are no longer able to purchase the good, maybe because of their income, because they could have afforded it at £10, but they can no longer afford it at £15. They tend to be those on lower incomes or those with more limited incomes than others. Okay, so more than just an inward shift in the supply curve. Remember that if it's an inelastic good, use your common sense. You're good economists at this stage. Use your common sense. If you know the good is inelastic, make sure and draw an inelastic curve. That'll give you more application marks. It's an inward shift in supply. It decreases the cost of, it increases the cost of production. It decreases the profit incentive. We've then got our burdens of tax on both the consumer and the producer. And in this case, because it's an inelastic good, it is the consumer that pays the greater burden of tax than what the producer does. And we're making the good more excludable. We're pushing out of the market those on lower incomes. Just to finish up then, I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint again and just finish off some other key notes. So I did mention before, the government would rather place indirect taxes on commodities where demand is inelastic because the tax causes only a small fall in the quantity consumed. And as a result, the total revenue from taxes will be greater. An example of this is the high level of duty on cigarettes and petrol. These are very inelastic goods. The government continue to place very high taxes on them, but consumption is only reducing at a very small rate because they are very inelastic. We often, certainly if you look at fuel, many people will rely on fuel to get to and from work. They prefer to drive as opposed to use public transport. Again, a graph giving you some indication in terms of the duties that have been placed on cigarettes. If you look at from March 2007 to March 2013, what that is basically saying is that we're placing now a greater value of tax on cigarettes than what we would have done so. So from 2007 to 2010, it was relatively stable. From 2011 to 2013, it continues to rise almost quite significantly in some cases there. Some problems with the tax to correct market failure. So this is your evaluation now. It's all well and good. Tax is all well and good in reducing consumption, but there are some issues surrounded with it that we as economists need to look under, that deeper layer of skin behind these policies. So the aim of an indirect tax is to make the offender pay and so internalize the externality. However, implementing this tax is problematic. So we want the person who's causing the most damage to pay for the impacts of that damage. So if you're a smoker, we want you to pay for the impact of smoke-related illnesses. If you're drinking alcohol, we want you to pay for the damage that's caused by alcohol-related illness. So it's difficult setting the right rate of tax, for example, if the monetary value of a negative externality is hard to measure. It's hard, if not almost impossible, to measure the rate of that externality. Okay, it's quite difficult to get that rate right in some cases. And again, ask yourself the question. I always say to students, if I said to you that you've won the lottery, the next question is likely to be, well, by how much? So if I said to you, you've won £20 in the lottery versus you've won 20 million on the lottery, I can imagine which one would have greater significance to you. So placing a tax on cigarettes is good, but if I only placed a 50p tax on cigarettes, that's likely to have very little impact. But if I placed a £4 or £5 tax per pack of cigarettes, that's going to have a greater significant impact on the consumption of cigarettes because the rate of tax is higher. Cost of collection, for example, road charging requires expensive infrastructure. Always think of the Dartford crossing. It's all done electronically. Gone are the barriers whenever you would have put through coins or your card if you're ever going through the Dartford crossing before. Now it's an automatic, it registers your number plate and then you pay electronically online. The cost of setting up that infrastructure would be quite significant. And when setting the rate of tax, governments will also have to factor in the cost of paying back that infrastructure. Inelastic demand, always a really good one to throw into your final evaluation paragraph. However, it depends on the elasticity of the good. Higher petrol prices via higher indirect taxes has little effect on demand for fuel. Likewise, would a tax on sugar get people to cut the consumption of high sugar products? It has shown an impact, but again, is it really showing the impact that we would want in society? Is a tax really the most effective strategy in reducing consumption? Redistribution effects. Indirect taxes are regressive and affect low-income households most. Always think about this. Think about taxes on cigarettes and alcohol. If we place a tax on cigarettes and alcohol, are we only reducing consumption of those in low incomes? What about those on high incomes that can afford the increase in tax? Okay, they're going to continue to smoke and continue to drink alcohol and therefore continue to have a negative effect on their health and the health of other people. Increased cost. Higher indirect taxes may cause inflation, affecting consumers who did not pollute and international competitiveness if taxes are higher in one country than another. So what we don't want is setting taxes too high that we basically create a disincentive for UK businesses to leave the domestic country and move to foreign countries where the rate of tax and the rate of doing business is much cheaper. Finally, then, to finish up, some evaluation arguments when assessing an indirect tax: the effectiveness of a tax and the unintended consequences. Does an indirect tax really achieve its specific aims? Because it is so inelastic, yes, we are reducing consumption, but we're only reducing consumption by a small amount. There are unintended consequences of introducing changing a tax. Is it going to cause inequality? If we exclude those on low incomes, we're going against the government's objective of creating a fairer society. So we're making those who are already worse off basically unable now to purchase the goods that they want to. We're controlling too much of their behavior. How much revenue are we going to collect? Are we going to collect enough revenue to solve the externalities or to pay for the negative externalities associated with the consumption of that good? So think about the tax that we place on alcohol, for example. Is the total revenue received from the tax on alcohol, is that actually going to help solve or pay for alcohol-related illnesses through the NHS? Remember, that's a burden on the NHS. How is the tax revenue used, perhaps for a particular project? Now, the best evaluation would be, your recommendation would be possibly, if you look at cigarettes, to tax cigarettes in terms of tobacco cigarettes, but with the revenue received from taxation, use that to subsidize maybe e-cigarettes, or to subsidize classes to educate people about the dangers of smoking, or to provide support to pregnant mothers, for example, to encourage them to stop smoking during pregnancy. What is the impact on the business, the competitiveness? Too often with tax, we think of the dangers on the consumers, but we also have to think about, well, what about the companies who are producing these goods that rely on the consumption of these goods in order to make a profit? That's the main objective of the firm. Might there be a loss of jobs and or investment? So if we place too much of a tax on these goods, firms will decrease their supply. Part of decreasing their supply is decreasing their demand for factors of production. Labor is one of the factors of production. Will an indirect tax negatively affect competitiveness and trade? Will we be seen as being less competitive than other countries? Will we experience a reduction in GDP because of that fall in demand? Think about the macro impacts. Consequences of equity and the distribution of income. Is that tax fair? Who are the winners and who are the losers? Often the winners are the government, because they get tax revenue. The losers are consumers, because they have to reduce consumption of the good. But the greater losers are those on low incomes, because they can no longer afford that good. They have been excluded out of the market because of their inability to pay a higher price. Does a tax have a regressive effect on low income groups? So does it have a negative impact on those from low incomes? So hopefully you found that useful in giving you an overview on what a tax is, how exactly a tax works. You are now more confident on the workings of the diagram, and you're able to evaluate, to challenge the true effectiveness of that tax, and to think about the unintended consequences associated with the consumption of goods with an indirect tax imposed on it.